So good morning, everybody. I'm representing the Work Package 3 team. My co-lead, Rick, you've just seen, but we also have Mira Zutkes and Paco Welsing, who's actually here today, who are very active and in the lead team of this work package. And we have a big workers team, representatives from both industry and non-industry, academia, and other organizations that work very well together. Our specific topic was making pragmatic trials work. Actually, this was a development of several steps that led us to this specific focus on pragmatic trials. We started off to look at operational issues that hinder you to do real-world effectiveness work. And through the kind of initial meetings we had, we realized we have to concentrate on one trial design, in this case, the most difficult to tackle from an operational issue sense, and hoping that lots of the findings we get from pragmatic trials, we can also apply to other real-world evidence studies potentially. So, but the focus of our work package is really the operational issues that you encounter when designing a pragmatic trial. Quick overview, just for the uninitiated, why and what are pragmatic trials, and then a focus on the practical challenges that we found in our work package. And Peter will actually introduce a tool that we're proposing to you to help trial designers to overcome operational issues when you design a pragmatic trial. So why pragmatic trials? We've heard in the morning already that we need more real-world effectiveness data, so data that are collected under usual care settings, not in their restricted trial settings. And we also need comparative data, so we need to understand how is a potentially new drug doing compared to another drug. But what is much more important in the real world, how is actually a new treatment strategy comparing to an old strategy. It's not only the drug, as we've heard this morning, that plays a big role, so that it's the entire strategy that is important to assess. And where we have the conventional RCT, the usual clinical trial setups and observational studies, we encounter difficulties with both settings. So there problem with their randomized controlled trials, as we heard, is their rigidity, their small populations, not really reflecting usual care. Whereas in an observational study, which is very good for certain aspects, to do a comparative strategy comparison is difficult because you're facing with a lot of bias that you can't control for. So we propose another option that is helping you in the mosaic of research, which is the pragmatic trial. Nothing new. It's been proposed already in the late 60s in a publication from Schwarz and Lelouch, so it's nothing that we obviously invented, and it has been used in various contexts as mostly post-launch, but as we heard, Salford is one of the first pre-launch pragmatic trials that has been running successfully. The advantage of a pragmatic trial is that it actually can combine the strength of a traditional RTC, because you have the randomization of treatment or treatment strategy at baseline, so you ensure comparability between the treatment arms. But it also has the usual care setup of an observational study, because in an ideal pragmatic trial, you try to limit your intervention to just the randomization of the treatment strategy, and the rest is really trying to observe what is happening under usual care circumstances. However, these trials are actually not that easy, even though they sound easy to set up, because you're faced with quite a lot of operational issues, and that was what Work Package 3 really tried to tackle over the last 2.5 years. So the work package, just very quickly, we aim to facilitate the design of conduct of pragmatic trials by giving insights into the design consequences. So if you do a design choice, what are the consequences, and tackling the operational challenges. We would like to visualize this complex interplay between these challenges and the impact they have in a tool, so that a trial designer will have a easier way of actually understanding what he's facing in the conduct of a pragmatic trial. And the aim is, with this tool, is hopefully that we can maximize the generalizability of trial findings and ensure the validity and make it still possible to run the trial. What we've seen in lots of the so-called pragmatic trials was that they start off as very pragmatic under the ideal setup, but with all the challenges you're facing, you're ending up with something that is very similar to a normal RCT. So it's very important to find solutions so that the as ideal possible pragmatic trial is feasible in the real world. This is the biggest challenge so far, is the click here. I was told to click here, but okay, here we go. So very briefly, many of you may have seen this slide in various contexts and in various formats. It's for the uninitiated. One thing that is really important on this slide is just one word in the middle up here, which is the continuum. So it's important to understand that a pragmatic trial is not one specific set design, but it is more on a continuum. It can be very pragmatic, or it can be less pragmatic. If it is less pragmatic, it's going very much towards the explanatory side of a normal RCT. And if you go very much onto the pragmatic side, you are much closer to the observational study side, but you still have the intervention at baseline. So it's important to understand, when we talk about a pragmatic trial, we have the randomization at baseline of the treatment strategies. So whereas on the left side, where an explanatory RCT trial is concentrating on the efficacy, can the treatment work? In a pragmatic trial, you're more looking, does it work in the reality? So that's why we're looking at effectiveness. We want to minimize the variation in a randomized controlled trial. We have a rigid protocol, and as we heard from the previous comments from the audience, rigid protocol also means we have a rigid inclusion criteria for the patients. So you exclude probably on average 90% of the patients taking up the drug in the later stage. So in a pragmatic trial, you try to broaden this inclusion criteria so that patients actually have a way to participate in the research, and then later on also have a way to benefit from the drug once it's out in the market. Also, from a practical standpoint, whereas you have data collection in a kind of RCT way that is much more beyond what you normally collect in a usual care, which makes it obviously more complex, but you will assess hard research outcomes that are actually very important for the further development. But what we are looking in a pragmatic trial is much more data collection as it happens in usual care. So hopefully you can use as much of the IT setups or electronic health records that are collected anyway, so that you don't interfere further in the way you do your trial with the usual care. And we are really looking at outcomes that are clinically relevant. And when I talk about clinically relevant, it is relevant hopefully for the physician prescribing the drug, but also for the patient. The patient himself doesn't probably benefit from knowing that his blood pressure is reduced by 1%. It's really, does he feel better? So these outcomes are covered most likely in a pragmatic trial. So important decision makers can use these, whether it's a physician or a policymaker or a patient or a physician can use these data. These data should be generalizable to the population you're interested in. It's not that you do a trial and it's generalizable automatically to absolutely everyone, but you have a research question that you want to be sure is answered for that population that is relevant to your research question. And you actually look at real-world alternatives. groups, rather than in a RCT where you have very kind of either placebo or very specific control arms. We're looking at strategies that are used, and that could be a combination of various usual care or standard of cares. Oh, God. I keep going. Okay, here we go. Oops, too much. So the challenges that we identified through the work we've done a big literature review and a stakeholder interview process with 35 very heterogeneous stakeholders, including patient organization, policymakers, industry representatives, regulators. So we have a broad range of stakeholders involved in our interview process, and we realized the challenges that you face doing designing a pragmatic trial. They may be sometimes similar to an RCT and observational, but some are actually quite different, because you're facing the conundrum that you want to have a certain rigor, understanding what is going on, but you don't want to influence anything that could interrupt usual care. So it's an operational issue that is different from those two categories. And the design choices you then take to try to overcome these operational issues, we have seen in the literature actually have an impact on, in the worst case, on the validity of the results, which makes the trial unusable as it is, but also on the generalizability. So you may start off with something that is very generalizable, but you end up with the results that are actually not that generalizable than what you thought. And also impact on precision and feasibility and acceptability of the trial. Is the trial in the way doable for physicians in usual care? So there are lots of issues that you need to overcome. And this complex interplay that we have mapped out on a big spreadsheet, we realize to help a trial designer to kind of have an overview, what is going on, we need to have a tool that kind of walks someone through the different steps and gives the options. It's not that it's designing the trial for you, but it gives you the options how you can improve the trial to a way that you want for answering your question. So from the literature review and the stakeholder interviews, we came up with different categories to bucket all these issues. They're ranging from regulatory to ethical issues, over the site selection to the patient. How can we make the relevant patients to be included? What is the intervention? What is the comparator? Is it standard of care? Is it usual care? May not be the same in different countries, different regions. What is the outcome selection? Often the discussion is immediately that you would like, people want to hear this, compare this trial to the RCT that was done in phase 3, but this is maybe an outcome that is actually not relevant in real world. So there's a lot of discussion around the outcomes. The data collection, how can you do that without interrupting usual care? Safety monitoring. As an interventional trial, a pragmatic trial has the randomization, therefore it is interventional. At the current status, we have to adhere to the European directive that doesn't differentiate between a normal RCT and a pragmatic trial. You have to follow up on all the requirements of a normal clinical trial. This will hopefully change significantly whenever the new regulation comes into place, where there is a low interventional category that probably would match most likely what we want to do here. But this currently doesn't help us in the pre-launch environment. So there's still issues that need to be solved as we go on. Statistical issues obviously are overarching. They interfere with all what you do. And you have to be aware that certain things are different. For example, if you do a cluster randomized trial, you're facing a bigger sample size. This will increase the cost. So it has an impact that is not only on a statistical side, but actually impacts on the feasibility of the trial if you end up with many more patients than you originally thought so. So all this needs to be considered, and all the links between these nice leaf buckets, they're actually waving in the wind. So they're all interlinked. So it's not that it's so crystal clear as it is shown here on the... thing. So just to give one brief example about the site selection, if you look at what you do, how do you choose the location? What are the sites, what are the countries you involve? So you have several questions to answer here. If it's a multinational trial, is the ethical, legal, language requirements, are they different in these different countries? We see that especially in the European Union, the current directive can be superimposed by local laws and regulations, so what you think is quite clear in the directive is actually less clear going down to specific regions. So you may have in the south of Spain different requirements than in the north of Spain. So this is still very complicated. Hopefully, again, better when the regulation is out, but we don't know exactly how this is going to be translated. But again, what I mentioned before, standard of care, usual care, what do we actually want to hear? What is the question here? So do the HTA organizations with whom you have price negotiations accept the standard of care, or do they want to see the usual care? There's often a wide range, and they don't match together. Okay, in the setting, what setting? Primary care, secondary, tertiary. How do you link in and out patients? It's something that, with a wide range of patients that you include, is sometimes very complex to organize from an operational issue. What are the logistics? If you have very small sites that have never been part of a trial because they were not regarded in the normal RCTs, how can you actually make a GP with just one doctor participate in something? How can he bear the burden of additional research done in his usual care? Similar is the site experience. Do you need extra dedicated study staff? Do you need, can you deal with what they have, or do you have to implement specific people, as was done in the Salford study, to run the study on a with a specific stuff that is local to the site? Do they need extra training? If you offer extra training, do you then interfere with usual care? So do you take away generalizability to other sites who do not have this extra training? So you have to balance out these pulling factors to actually make a decision how you go forward. Is the site representative in terms of recruitment? How do you organize recruitment? So these are all, sorry, I'm clicking issues that need to be considered when you select a site. And while you're doing this, you actually have to look at how this impacts on concepts of generalizability, validity, and precision. And again, just as a very brief example from the site selection, generalizability. Are these sites really generalizable to their real-world target population? Or is it something that you kind of use sites because they're practical, they're accessible, they're willing to participate, but you know, the bigger representation is not going to work because not all sites are covered. How is the usual care practiced? Are the comparators comparable? Risk of bias. You would think because you have the randomization at start, you take care of any bias. But in a pragmatic trial, most likely it's an open label drug. So is there any preference a physician may have towards one or the other drug? And therefore, his assessment is potentially biased by knowing that the patient is on this drug. Similar is a patient maybe not kind of very happy to be on the usual care and would like to have their kind of loses interest in the trial. Is there a higher loss to follow up? This would bias the end results despite the randomization you have at study start. In terms of precision, you may have different physicians measure the outcome in a different way. This is part of what we want to see because this is still showing the heterogeneity of how things are done. But on the other side, you have to be careful that your estimate, your confidence interval isn't going so wide that you actually can't really see the effect anymore because the precision has been lost. So the goal is really to try to minimize the bias and the variability while you maximize the generalizability and the feasibility. It's not that one goes automatically up when the other goes down, but nevertheless, they're often interlinked. in summary, so the design choices that you do in a pragmatic trial can have an impact on the validity and generalizability and precision. And this gets lost oftentimes during the design process because people just concentrate on the design and not looking at the impact. And stakeholders, various stakeholders, and I'm very happy about the comment from the patient because that's our tool is actually really trying to involve the patients as a much earlier stage than it's usually done in a trial result, as well as other stakeholders like policymakers and regulators. So it's something that you should involve the stakeholder much earlier to really understand, is this trial answering the question you have? And if this is all done, and if you are confident into your design, so a carefully executed pragmatic trial really does have the potential to deliver valid real-world evidence data. And Peter will show the tool in a kind of draft format because it's still in a pilot as we go. And a part of this tool, just a series that I would like to make you aware of. This is a series we have submitted to the Journal of Clinical Epi about all these issues we found. It's coming out hopefully soon. The first, I think, 5 papers have been submitted. So that's something to look out for in the Journal of Clinical Epi in the near future. And I hand over to Peter to continue with Pragmagic. Do you have your own one? Oh, oh yeah.
With a new battery.
Hopefully. Okay.
Thank you, Iris. And as Iris already said, I will, in the next 10-15 minutes, I will show you a little bit of the work that we are doing on a tool which tries to bring together a lot of the knowledge and the work that has been done within Work Package 3 and to deliver that to any relevant audiences for the future. And that is, of course, in addition to all the scientific work that's being published in peer-reviewed papers and will be available in the literature. So basically, the goal of the tool that we are building, and the working title is Pragmagic, is to really bring together all this knowledge and all these insights, both from GetReal, but also from other projects and from experts, and to present that to people who are working on the design of clinical trials or are discussing design of clinical trials, both in academia and industry, in HTA and regulatory. And really what we're trying to do is to bring together all this information in a structured way and to help discussions and decisions. So what it is not, it will not be a decision-making tool. It will not be a checklist to assure whether you are complying to all relevant rules and regulations, and it won't be a quality check or a verdict on any study. It's really something to help fuel the discussions in a structured way and to provide relevant insights. So it's a web-based tool that we are building. It can be used. It will live on the internet, but all the results will live locally, also to ensure that people can use this tool for confidential discussions within their own organization. We are working together with a serious gaming company to build this. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, so serious gaming is a way to use some of the concepts that come from gaming or related fields, and to use them to present complex information to users. And the picture that I show you here is from a project that the company that we are working with did last year, which is virtual ER patients, which they use to train ER doctors in academic medical centers, and trying to really present this complex patients with a complex pharmacological, clinical, chemical, pathological model behind it, and to bring that together in a gaming environment where a doctor is tasked to help this patient and help the patient survive. So we brought in their expertise into GetReal to help them think with us on how we could build such a tool that I just described to you. So where we are at the moment, I always say we are at about 30% of building this tool. So the first part of GetReal is really focused on understanding the problem, doing a lot of the background work, and in this last year we are working on this tool. So where we are now, if I can try to use a car analogy, we are currently building the engine of this tool and trying to understand all the nuts and bolts. In the next period, we will be working on the interface, the user interface, but also the reporting back of the information while further building on the engine and filling in the content. And in the final stages of the project, we'll really be working on the final design so that we have something that can drive out of the factory. So the tool consists of three modules. A first module, which will ask the user for background information on their trial. A second is more sort of really the engine of the tool, the review of the design options, and finally the tool will report out to the users. Currently, we will focus mostly on module 2, in which I will present today. Just to briefly give you an overview of the others as well. So module 1, as I said, will request baseline information on the trial that is currently being discussed. So that could be what is the type of trial, what's the setting in which is the country in which it will be conducted, what are the objectives, what type of intervention is it, etc., etc. So we will be collecting this information, and currently we are also looking at to what extent this, let's say, background information will have implications for the choices that will be made later on in the tool. So for example, if you say that it is an orphan drug, that can have implications for certain design options, of course. So that's really the first part. So the second part is what I said is currently the engine of the tool, and this is where a lot of the concepts that Iris has already introduced come together. So there are three key concepts, and Iris already mentioned them. The first one is the design option. So how we would like to define it here is it's a feature of a study chosen from a set of options. For example, what type of randomization, what type of study site, what is the comparator, what freedom do you allow the control arm to change therapy. So those kinds of things. And all those decisions, and when you think about a clinical trial, there are hundreds of those decisions that you have to make fall under different categories of design options in our tool. So we identify 7 coming out of the background work that we have done, the interviews and the papers. So we have design options around patients, participants in the trial, the site, the outcome measure and the type of outcome, the comparator, the data collection, how is data collected, what are specific requirements, safety, and finally quality assurances. So these are the 7, what I would call here the design option categories. The second concept is the implication. So those are the effects or the impact that a certain design option has on a number of methodological, stakeholder, or resource aspects of the study. And also these were introduced briefly before by Iris, but just to highlight them here, we have 3 categories. So they can have methodological implications and a design option that you make. So for example, if you choose a placebo as a comparator, well, that will have implications for the generalizability of your findings, perhaps. So there are many other methodological implications, of course, as well. Then there are certain design options that can have implications for different types of stakeholders. So will this could this have impact on your ethical assessment, or is it relevant for your healthcare professionals? Would they require extra training? And finally, of course, resources, and time and money are, of course, the 2 easiest categories of resources that we know. So the third concept is the operational challenge. And then when you have made a certain design options and have taken into consideration the implication, then there still may be some aspects when you conduct the study that you have to be aware of. For example, what I mentioned earlier, when you work in a certain setting where prescribers may not be familiar with working within a trial environment that has some operational challenges with regard to the training of the doctors. It doesn't mean that that you cannot address it, but it's something that you have to take into consideration when executing the study. What I will show you now, just briefly, is some of the work that we have been doing on the engine. And actually, here you can see one of our work package members working on the prototype. Please take into consideration so that at the moment we are working on the engine. So what you see here is, for example, one question which focuses on the comparator and then asks the user how are the new and experimental treatment and usual care treatment compared. And then there are a number of options. And each of those options has implications. So what we say for each, and probably you can't see it, but I think the slides will be circulated afterwards. So for example, one option maybe, when you look at it from a more pragmatic trial perspective, could be preferred from a generalizability perspective. That doesn't mean that we say this is what you should do. It's just something that we want to bring to your attention in this tool. Also, it could be different from your study. We realize that we are trying to create something that is generic for a wide variety of studies. But this will be how we present sort of the concepts, how they will be introduced in the study. And the final tool will allow you to make notes and to make additions to say, well, what is stated here is not relevant for our study. You can click on each of the fields, and then you will get more information about why the tool states that, and will be referred to background literature or to external websites, etc., etc. So then, of course, but just to give you sort of the scale of complexity, is that, of course, for a trial, as I said, there are many questions. So when you go one level up, you see that this is just one of the questions of many within a certain design option category. And then, of course, when you go back to the trial, you see that you end up with a lot of information about this trial. And we now have that in the background in a lot of documents and information. So one of the challenges that we are working on with the team at our serious gaming company is how to present all this information to the user, because of course this is still an engine, and also I always like this quote: if your user interface even vaguely resembles an airplane cockpit, you're doing it wrong. And I think you would all agree that maybe this looks a little bit like maybe a DNA test or whatever, but that we need to present this to the user in a more user-friendly way. So that's something that we are working on. But first, of course, you have to understand the mechanics behind what you're doing. Of course, that's also a challenge for how we'll report out to the user. So the tool will generate reports which will summarize based on the questions, how they were answered, the potential implications of this study on the different areas. These reports can be saved locally. They can be used for discussions within teams, etc., etc. So just that they help to provide the discussion within organizations with some of the relevant information. This reporting module is still under construction, and one of the challenges, for example, is really because we are very aware that these can be very confidential processes, also especially since there will probably a lot of note-taking around the different choices made, that this has to be stored locally in a secure manner, of course. So where are we now? As I said, we're currently building a prototype in Q3, so that's in 2 weeks, I guess, we will be starting field testing, adding content, further developing the tool. Then in Q4, as I said, hopefully the car will drive out of the factory, and we will also be working on sustainability, because this is something that we are starting on, and it's work in progress, but we do want to continue it in the future. And I think once you see sort of the first version, you will also acknowledge that it is useful and that it deserves further development. But of course, we have to think about a model around that. Of course, since this is an IMI product, it has to continue beyond the end of this year. But that's also something that we'll be working on. So this is all that I wanted to say, just within 15 minutes on the tool that we are working on in Work Package 3. Watch this space, I would say. But I don't know if you have any questions so far.